We are setting the scene today in 1850s Wisconsin. And the story we're about to unpack isn't just about, you know, human resilience or the sheer physical grit of frontier settlers. It's fundamentally a story about physics, about material science and the brutal, the uncompromising math of survival. This deep dive is our attempt to understand how applied thermal dynamics, literally just the physics of heat, determined who lived and who succumbed to the cold.
That's the key distinction, isn't it? We have this tendency to romanticize the American frontier. We think of it as a struggle against, distance or wildlife or just clearing the land. But for the people who settled the big woods, the most immediate, the most unyielding enemy was the cold. Especially during this period, the sources we have call the winter that hunted men.
Wow.
Yeah, and they were pitted against a climate that demanded efficiency, but they were armed only with technologies that were, profoundly wasteful.
So our mission today is really to cut through some of that folklore and get right to the thermodynamics of survival. We're going to contrast the early, sort of fast-paced American approach to innovation, the Franklin stove, with this centuries-old, old-world wisdom that's embodied in the German masonry heater, the Kachelofen.
Right.
And we've got a fantastic stack of sources for this, everything from pioneer journals to, believe it or not, engineering schematics. And we really want to pull out the core insights from that historical moment.
And we're exploring the core conflict here, which really just boils down to iron versus clay, fast conductivity versus slow thermal mass. It's the story of how just one critical design failure amplified the physical burden on every single settler, leading to what they rightly named the tyranny of the axe. We'll show you exactly how one fundamental shift in heating technology saved lives and really redefined domestic life on the frontier.
We really need to start by establishing the sheer scale of the challenge here, the environmental challenge. When we say 1850s Wisconsin, I think a lot of us might picture a snowy but, a manageable modern winter. The reality they faced was, well, it was a remnant of a much colder era.
Precisely. The sources are pretty clear that this era was still feeling the profound chilling effects of what climate scientists would categorize as the echoes of the Little Ice Age. We're not talking about your annual deep freeze. We are talking about winters that routinely saw temperatures just plummet to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit.
Minus 30.
Minus 30 Fahrenheit, which is about minus 34 Celsius. And it would just hold there for days, maybe weeks on end. This wasn't a brief cold snap. The deep snowpack, the freezing conditions, they often lasted for 5 straight months.
5 months.
Just imagine trying to run a farm, trying to raise a family in those conditions, knowing that any failure to generate enough heat meant certain death.
And the geography is almost a paradox, isn't it? It offered this false sense of security. Settlers were surrounded by the big woods, these dense, just unrelenting forests of massive hardwood trees, oak, maple, hickory. From a distance, it looks like an unlimited supply of fuel. Wood was, in a word, plentiful. But that abundance, that was a cruel trick. It masked the true killer, which was the labor cost.
That's the point the pioneer journals make again and again. They weren't fighting a scarcity of fuel, they were fighting the density of it. The labor it took to transform a massive, standing, frozen hardwood tree into manageable, split, dry logs was the single most demanding and relentless task of frontier life. It was the primary source of chronic physical injury, exhaustion, you name it, settler burnout. It became this feedback loop where the abundance of wood only highlighted the impossibility of harvesting enough of it.
And this brings us right to trying to quantify this tyranny of the axe. Let's put a concrete number on it, on the physical toll. According to some really detailed historical estimates based on household size, climate data for the region, a single family needed about 20 cords of wood to survive one severe Wisconsin winter.
20 cords. Yeah, and that number is so abstract until you actually visualize it. For anyone listening, a cord is a stack of wood that measures 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 8 feet long. It's a surprisingly massive volume of wood.
So 20 of those.
20 of those. Stacked up next to a typical cabin, it would look like a literal mountain of timber. And to get that, you had to fell the trees, limb them, buck them into lengths, and then, and this was the most brutal part, split them all by hand in sub-zero temperatures.
The sources calculate that for a typical settler family just dedicating themselves to survival, wood chopping wasn't like a seasonal thing. It was a year-round necessity. And during the winter, this effort became the equivalent of a full-time job, and a physically crippling one at that.
Yep. You can even try to do a caloric calculation here, which brings the brutality into really stark relief. Logging, heavy splitting, especially in extreme cold, it burns upwards of 500, maybe 700 calories an hour. easily. So to process 20 cords, you're talking thousands of man-hours.
Which means that a huge portion of the meager calories the settler was getting from hunting or their early farming had to be immediately reinvested right back into the labor of just staying alive. If you weren't chopping, that caloric debt would catch up and you would freeze.
And it wasn't just physical exhaustion. The sources, they detailed the pervasive dangers that just became normal. We're talking about severe, deep frostbite, the kind that costs you fingers and toes, from working a steel axe head in temperatures that froze your hands almost immediately.
Right.
We're talking about debilitating back injuries from lifting and swinging that axe for hours on end. And of course, the constant immediate threat of a laceration or a fatal injury from the axe just slipping on a frozen log.
So the task is more than a chore. It's a daily gamble.
It is. The tyranny of the axe wasn't just about the volume of wood. It was about the continuous, dangerous nature of the labor. It prevented settlers from doing other things that were essential for their long-term development. Time spent chopping was time not spent building a better house or developing fields or teaching your children. It locked the whole frontier settlement process into this dangerous state of perpetual reactive survival, this unsustainable labor model. It required a technological intervention.
So the settlers are paying this astronomical physical price, 20 cords, just to get the fuel. Now let's look at the technology they were relying on to turn that fuel into heat. And the default system for almost all early American homes was the open hearth fireplace.
And looking at it through the lens of physics, the open hearth is just a masterclass in inefficiency. While it's wonderful for cooking and, it provides that psychological comfort, that sense of warmth as a space heating mechanism, it's fundamentally flawed. It acts primarily as a massive intentional heat sink. It pulls heat away from the living space.
Okay, let's unpack that physics failure, because this is where this idea of a 90% loss comes from. Why is a chimney, which is designed to get rid of smoke, so counterproductive to actually keeping a room warm?
Well, the chimney works by creating a powerful vacuum, a draft. Hot gases from the fire rise, they create a low-pressure area, and that then pulls replacement air into the room. But that replacement air has to come from somewhere. And in a crudely built 1850s log cabin, it's pulled in through every tiny crack, every gap, every chink in the walls, the floor, the window frames. And that replacement air is, critically, at minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit.
So just to get rid of a small amount of smoke, the hearth is constantly inhaling these huge volumes of frigid outdoor air.
Exactly. And most of the heat that's generated by the fire isn't radiated into the room at all. It's immediately entrained in that draft and just swept right up the flue. The astonishing calculation, which has been confirmed by early thermodynamic studies, is that an open hearth typically loses about 90% of the heat content of the burning wood directly up the chimney.
We have to pause on that number. 90% loss. That means of the 20 cords that settler chopped and sweated and bled for, 18 of those cords were completely wasted. They're literally just heating the Wisconsin sky, which makes the constant labor not just dangerous, but profoundly pointless from an efficiency standpoint.
The psychological toll of that realization must have been just immense. Imagine the depth of exhaustion, knowing you worked for days on a stack of wood, only to see 9/10 of the energy just, poof, dissipate instantly. This incredible wastefulness is why the tyranny of the axe was so oppressive. The settlers had to keep chopping at a superhuman rate just to offset the inherent failure of their heating system.
And it wasn't only the cold and the labor. We need to detail the severe health consequences that were tied directly to relying on that open hearth. It wasn't just a cold house, it was a sick house.
Yeah. Beyond the acute exposure to freezing temperatures, chronic health risks were just rampant. The sources specifically cite health issues associated with high levels of particulate matter and smoke exposure. You see terms like soot and lungs hardening all over the records. A poor draft often meant a significant amount of smoke and uncombusted hydrocarbons were just lingering in the living space.
That low-level, continuous exposure, it's like sitting next to a smoky campfire for half the year. It must have had devastating effects.
It did. It drastically lowered resistance to respiratory diseases, pneumonia, tuberculosis, which were major killers on the frontier. And furthermore, we now understand the dangers of carbon monoxide, which an inefficient drafty fire can produce. And while they didn't have the science to name it, the symptoms of CO poisoning, chronic headaches, lethargy, just a general malaise, they would have been pervasive, and that further crippled their ability to perform the constant labor they needed to survive.
And critically, who was most affected by this internal pollution?
Well, the people who spent the most time indoors, right by the hearth, managing the fire, the women and children. The whole fireplace civilization was built on profound thermal waste and systemic, chronic, poor health for the most vulnerable members of the family unit. Clearly, a technological change was needed to address this fundamental failure. And this problem of the wasteful open hearth, it wasn't just isolated to the 1850s frontier. It was recognized much earlier in colonial cities like Philadelphia. And this brings us to Benjamin Franklin back in 1742, attempting to apply Enlightenment principles to fire management.
Franklin was the quintessential American innovator, wasn't he? Pragmatic, focused on immediate functional improvement. He was determined to apply reason to the chaos of the fireplace.
And he developed what he called the Pennsylvania fireplace, which we all know as the Franklin stove. The design was truly revolutionary for its time. It was essentially a cast iron box, freestanding in the room. The critical innovation was forcing the smoke through a sort of complicated path using a baffle system before it was allowed to escape up the chimney. This drastically increased the surface area that could radiate heat into the room.
And since it wasn't built into the wall, it could radiate heat from the sides, too. It was a massive leap forward from the open hearth. It was fast, it was relatively cheap to manufacture compared to masonry, and it represented instant modernization. It was absolutely considered a revolution in a box.
Indeed. And for the climate of, say, Philadelphia or Boston, it was a major improvement. It increased efficiency, maybe reducing that waste from 90% down to, I don't know, 70% or 60%. And that reduction was significant in less brutal climates.
Okay, but this is where we need to introduce the critical nuance. Was the Franklin stove really better for the extreme conditions of the Wisconsin deep winter? This is where the material science of cast iron revealed a fatal frontier flaw.
That's the critical difference. The flaw wasn't in the geometry of the stove, it was in the material itself. We have to focus on the thermal properties of cast iron. Iron has high thermal conductivity.
Right.
This means it's an excellent transmitter of heat. You light the fire, and within minutes, that iron box is hot, and it's radiating this intense blast energy into the room.
So it gives you that instant gratification, that instant-on feeling that appeals so much to the American mindset of speed and immediate results.
Yeah.
But if the conductivity is high, what does that mean for its storage capacity?
It means its thermal mass is low, and thermal mass is the capacity of a material to absorb and store heat energy over time. Iron is terrible at this. It gets hot fast, but it cannot hold that energy. It just transfers it. And once the fuel is exhausted, the heat dissipates almost immediately.
So the settlers got this intense, instantaneous blast of heat, which must have felt wonderful for a moment. But the second the fire died down, the temperature in that cast iron stove would crash right back to ambient, almost instantly. It had no endurance.
Exactly. This rapid cooling meant that the Franklin stove, despite its innovation, failed to break the tyranny of the axe. The settlers still had to continuously feed the stove. They just replaced the large logs in the hearth with smaller, more frequent pieces of wood in the stove. If you wanted to sleep through the night without freezing, you had to wake up multiple times to stoke the embers and throw in more fuel. It demanded continuous, exhausting vigilance.
That sounds like an improvement in efficiency maybe, but a total zero-sum game when it comes to labor reduction. You just traded brute force chopping for continuous maintenance.
Precisely. And the material itself added this layer of unpredictable hazard on the frontier. Early American foundry techniques, especially for stoves going to distant, isolated markets, were inconsistent. And cast iron is brittle. It lacks tensile strength.
And the risk was thermal shock.
Right. Yes. The sources document the danger of thermal shock. If that roaring hot iron surface came into contact with something cold, say a gust of frigid air, or someone mistakenly threw cold water on it in a panic, the uneven, rapid cooling could cause the brittle iron to crack or fracture, or in extreme cases shatter violently, even explode if pressure built up inside. This was a terrifying, unpredictable safety hazard inside a small, remote cabin.
It's a really compelling technological moment, isn't it? A fast, smart American innovation that just completely fails the endurance test of the frontier. It's no wonder that German and Scandinavian immigrant groups who were used to generations of a different kind of technology, they immediately saw this fatal flaw. They viewed the Franklin stove as sophisticated, sure, but ultimately soulless.
That cultural critique is so fascinating. To the immigrants, soulless didn't mean it lacked beauty. It meant it lacked endurance. It lacked patience. It gave a lot of heat quickly, which was tempting, but it didn't hold that heat. They understood intuitively that survival against a 5-month-long winter wasn't about the fastest conductor. It was about the most durable reservoir. They needed a machine for storage, not just transmission. And this realization, it laid the groundwork for the masonry solution.
That critique leads us directly to the old world solution. And it was brought not by abstract theory, but by pragmatic generational knowledge. Our sources highlight the influence of figures like Klaus the blacksmith, who emigrated from regions like the Black Forest where deep winter survival depended on patient, stable heat.
Klaus and his contemporaries, they didn't invent the cachalot. It had been refined across Europe for centuries. But they brought the knowledge of how to build it to the American frontier, adapting it to local materials. And this represents that critical iron meets clay moment. Klaus realized that the firebox, which was brilliantly efficient at generating intense heat, needed to be domesticated.
Domestication, so wrapping it in a protective, energy-storing shell.
Exactly. The iron firebox was the dragon, the source of intense, volatile, immediate heat. And the structure of brick and clay was the shell, designed to absorb that energy and release it gently over a much, much longer period.
And this massive shell, it changed everything. It addressed the flaws of both the open hearth and the Franklin stove in three crucial ways, starting right at the heart of the system, the firebox. Unlike the drafty open hearth or the simple Franklin baffle, the cachalot used an airtight, sealed firebox.
And that seal is so essential. Beyond just keeping the smoke inside, what does it do?
It achieves near-perfect combustion chemistry. By controlling the oxygen supply precisely, you force the fire to burn at much higher temperatures. This intense hot burn means the fuel is consumed almost entirely, which reduces the creation of uncombusted gases and particulate matter, the very ingredients that form creosote.
So, better efficiency, significantly less dangerous residue, and less internal pollution. It directly addresses those health risks we talked about. But now we hit the fundamental engineering challenge. How do you safely wrap a fast, intensely hot iron structure in a slow-to-heat masonry shell when they expand at completely different rates?
This is where Klaus's expertise as a blacksmith and his understanding of materials really shines. He knew that the quick-to-heat iron firebox would expand aggressively and immediately when the fire was lit. If you mortared it directly into the brick, the immense force of that expanding metal would inevitably crack the surrounding masonry, rendering the stove useless.
And his solution? The crucial expansion joint.
Yes, the secret air gap. It was a deliberate, narrow void, an expansion joint between the iron firebox and the protective brick shell. This gap allowed the quickly expanding iron to flex and move without putting structural stress on the massive, slower-heating masonry. This simple engineering feature was absolutely critical to the functionality and durability of the cachalot on the frontier.
It's a brilliant piece of practical thermodynamics. It married the best of the American approach, that intense heat generation of the iron firebox, with the endurance and stability of the old world masonry. It created a functional, safe hybrid technology. Without that gap, the entire high-mass concept just fails the first time the fire reaches peak temperature.
It demonstrates a deep, intuitive understanding of differential expansion that was just often overlooked in the rush of American industrial manufacturing. The masonry heater was designed for long-term survival, not quick profit, and its complexity really reflects that patient engineering philosophy.
Now we get to the core physics that separates this technology from everything that came before it. Klaus didn't just wrap the firebox. He fundamentally altered the journey of the heat before it was allowed to leave the house. He literally forced the smoke to wander.
He designed a thermal labyrinth.
Exactly. Instead of the smoke rushing straight up and out like it does in the open hearth or the Franklin stove, the exhaust gases are forced through this complex, engineered path of horizontal and vertical brick channels. We call it the labyrinthine flue.
How long is this maze inside the structure? Are we talking about a few feet?
Oh, no, much longer. Depending on the size of the cachalot, the flue path could easily be 15 to 30 feet of serpentine channels just woven through the interior structure. And this extended journey, it forces a slow, intimate exchange between the superheated exhaust gases and the massive brick walls that enclose them.
That extended contact time ensures a highly efficient heat exchange. The goal, I assume, is to force the gases to give up nearly all their energy before they exit.
Precisely. The hot gases are forced to surrender their thermal energy to the immense mass of the surrounding brick walls before they exit the house. The effectiveness of this is it's astonishing. By the time the exhaust reaches the chimney cap, it is so cool, often barely warmer than the ambient indoor air, that the smoke is often invisible. Or just a wisp of steam. That's the 90% of energy that the open hearth was wasting, now captured and stored inside the house.
And this captured energy leads us to the core concept of the cachalot, thermal mass. It's not just a heater, it's a heat battery.
Let's define that concept precisely because it's the foundation of the technology. Thermal mass is directly related to the specific heat capacity of material. And specific heat capacity is just the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of a given mass of that material by 1 degree. Materials like metal have low specific heat capacity. They change temperature very rapidly. Materials like masonry, rock, clay, they have very high specific heat capacity.
Which means they can absorb a massive amount of energy without their temperature spiking dangerously high, and they hold on to that energy stubbornly.
Correct. The masonry components, especially the dense, often locally sourced Wisconsin refractory clay found in riverbeds, which can withstand extreme, sustained heat without cracking, they act as gigantic sponges for thermal energy. If the Franklin stove is a conductor, which transfers electricity immediately, the Katchelfin is a capacitor. It charges slowly and it discharges slowly. It stores the energy.
That comparison is perfect. You charge this massive masonry capacitor during a single burn cycle, typically lasting just 1 hour. What's the resulting liberation from the tyranny of the axe?
It is total liberation. The result is this profound simplification of labor. One concentrated fire for one concentrated hour could provide sufficient comfortable heat to the home for a full 24 hours, sometimes longer, depending on the insulation. Instead of 20 cords requiring perpetual vigilance and constant stoking, the settler needed maybe 5 or 6 cords of wood burned efficiently and quickly. You replace endless reactive labor with strategic planned patience.
But the feeling of the house is also fundamentally different, isn't it? We need to distinguish clearly between the two forms of heat delivery: convection versus long-wave infrared radiation.
A standard iron stove, like Franklin's, relies primarily on convection. Convection heats the air directly. Hot air is buoyant, so it rises immediately to the ceiling, which leads to significant temperature stratification. Hot heads, cold feet, drafty floors. The heat only lasts as long as the hot air stays in the room, and the air itself often feels dry and stale.
The masonry heater operates differently. Once that brick shell is saturated with thermal energy, it starts radiating heat through the physics of long-wave infrared radiation.
And this is the core magic. Long-wave infrared heat is the same energy form that travels from the sun to the earth, or from a hot rock face on a summer day. Our sources describe this as long-wave infrared warmth. It doesn't primarily heat the air. It passes through the air and is absorbed by solid objects, the walls, the furniture, and, crucially, your body.
So instead of being heated by hot air blowing around you, you're being heated from the solid objects all around you.
Exactly. The infrared energy vibrates the molecules in solid objects. You feel this pervasive, deep, even warmth that penetrates your clothes and bones. The walls themselves become warm, creating a thermal barrier against the outside cold. The floor stays warm. The air remains relatively fresh because the system is completely sealed and the air isn't being superheated and dried out. This radiant warmth fundamentally changed the sensory experience of living in a frontier cabin. It provided a stable, gentle climate that endured right through the night.
This adoption of the masonry heater, it wasn't just an engineering upgrade. It was a powerful moment where folk tech meets the frontier. It pitted centuries of highly specialized, patient old-world wisdom against the prevailing, fast-paced American building methods that prioritized industrial speed and standardized iron parts.
It forced a reevaluation of what efficiency truly meant in a survival context. The American ideal saw efficiency in mass production and fast transfer, the Franklin stove. The immigrant wisdom saw efficiency in maximum energy extraction and long-term storage, the Katchelfin. And when you're faced with minus 30 degrees, endurance suddenly supersedes speed as the ultimate measure of technological superiority.
And the settlers had to adapt their local resources to this old-world knowledge. The refractory clay found in Wisconsin riverbeds became a vital resource, allowing them to construct these highly specialized structures using accessible materials. It reinforced that self-sufficiency required on the frontier.
And that's an important detail. Masonry heaters weren't just transplanted, they were locally synthesized. The settlers needed to understand not just the design, but the material testing, how to mix the clay, the sand, the lime to create a mortar that would hold up to that intense internal heat without crumbling. This was not off-the-shelf technology. It was craftsmanship, relying on traditional techniques of firing and testing the clay for suitability.
Beyond the material and the economic implications, the most profound changes happened within the family unit itself. We have to analyze how this technology disrupted and ultimately liberated the existing gendered labor structure of the frontier home.
Historically, the labor of keeping the house warm was sharply divided. As we noted, men were out fighting the axe, focusing on the sheer quantity of fuel needed, the external battle against the elements.
And once that wood was delivered inside, the labor shifted entirely.
Yes. The constant, immediate, and dirty labor of fire management, the internal battle, fell to the women and children. They were responsible for maintaining the Fire 247, dealing with the soot and the ash, struggling with poor drafts, and the exhausting task of waking multiple times a night to stoke the embers in that highly conductive iron stove, desperately trying to prevent that instantaneous temperature crash.
That daily struggle for continuous vigilance and temperature management must have just consumed hours every single day, often in really smoky, unhealthy conditions.
It absolutely did. The transition to the masonry heater was a seismic shift for domestic life. We should talk about how that clean single-burn system affected the health and daily workload of women and children in the 1850s.
Well, the first, most immediate benefit was health. The sealed firebox and near-complete combustion drastically reduced the internal smoke and particulate matter. Those chronic issues of lungs hardening, they began to subside, improving general respiratory health and resistance to infection.
The liberation of time was the truly revolutionary aspect. Replacing perpetual stoking with one or two strategic, efficient burns per day freed up massive amounts of domestic labor time. Women no longer had to act as continuous fire tenders.
And how did that newfound time manifest on the frontier? The sources do give us some glimpses into how that liberated labor was repurposed.
It was often channeled into productive activities that secured the family's future rather than just their immediate survival. We see increased time dedicated to literacy and education for children, production of marketable domestic crafts weaving, spinning, candle making, which provided vital trade goods, and critically, time for social congregation and community building. The house became a cleaner, safer, more stable environment for both work and rest.
It's the ultimate trade-off, isn't it? A technological innovation that asks for more planning and initial effort, but returns its continuous dividend of health, safety, and time. The masonry heater effectively removed the axe's tyranny from both the exterior by reducing the fuel requirement and the interior by removing the need for constant fire maintenance. And on the frontier, that gift of time was invaluable.
When we examine the Catchaloffen, we are truly analyzing a different philosophy of living, what we might call the slow heat philosophy. It stands in such stark contrast to the modern mindset and even the emerging American industrial mindset of the 1850s.
Right. We're conditioned today to expect instantaneous control. You hit a switch, the microwave starts. You turn a dial, the HVAC unit blasts hot air. The Franklin stove, with its fast conductivity, was an early precursor to that instant-on mentality.
But Klaus's stove demanded a slow fire. Because of the high thermal mass, the family had to accept the physical reality that the stove might take 4 hours to reach its peak radiation point, its highest performance output. You cannot rush clay and stone.
How did that non-negotiable lag, that requirement for foresight, change the psychology of the family and their daily rhythm?
It encouraged a profound sense of planning and patience. You didn't just light the fire when you felt cold, you planned the burn cycle based on the weather forecast and the activities scheduled for the next 24 hours. If a blizzard was coming overnight, you loaded the stove in the late afternoon. This required families to operate on a patient, deliberate rhythm, respecting the materials and their intrinsic timing.
It replaces a reactive, exhausting struggle with a proactive, strategic engagement. It fosters a different kind of wisdom, one that's connected to seasonal cycles and material endurance, rather than the mechanical reliability of a rapidly working machine.
Furthermore, the sources raise a really profound ethical question related to both the Franklin stove and the masonry heater. The patent versus the gift. Both Benjamin Franklin, a keen businessman, and Klaus, the pragmatic craftsman, chose to withhold patents on their life-saving heating innovations.
Why refuse to capitalize on such vital technology?
Yeah.
Was this truly a moment of pure altruism, declaring that warmth and survival technology are a human right, not a profit opportunity?
It's a complex intersection of morality and practicality. For Franklin, the Enlightenment ideal certainly played a role, the sharing of knowledge for the common good. But on the 1850s frontier, that choice took on a much sharper edge of survival.
Because in the deep woods, where your community support was the only safety net you had, if your neighbor freezes to death because they couldn't afford a superior patented heater, that negatively impacts your survival too.
Precisely. In such a high-stakes, low-margin environment, it was in everyone's practical interest to ensure the most effective survival technology was the most accessible. Hoarding that knowledge through a patent would have limited the spread of the technology. It would have destabilized the entire community and ultimately endangered the patentees themselves through the collapse of their social support system. It was the absolute embodiment of the open-source nature of survival technology. Survival was a collaborative, non-proprietary endeavor.
That makes a refusal to patent a really profound statement about community value versus economic gain, especially in a time and place where both were desperately needed.
And finally, that patient, non-proprietary wisdom connects directly to our world today. Why, after nearly 2 centuries of central air and fossil fuel dominance, are we seeing a significant masonry heater renaissance?
It's the ultimate full circle, a demand for enduring efficiency driven by our contemporary concerns about climate and the cost of energy.
The environmental justification is powerful. In an era concerned about our carbon footprint, people are turning back to wood, but they need to use it with maximum responsibility. The Catchloaf design ensures near complete combustion because of its high internal temperatures and sealed environment. This means significantly less particulate pollution than a typical wood stove.
And the high efficiency means you use dramatically less fuel, making wood harvesting potentially carbon neutral if it's managed responsibly.
Yes, the masonry heater represents deep, refined efficiency. It provides an independent, durable heat source using locally sourced, renewable fuel stored passively in the structure of the house itself. It stands as a powerful statement that sometimes the solutions to our most pressing modern challenges, energy independence, sustainability, durability, they lie not in the latest, fastest digital innovation, but in the slow, patient material wisdom of the past.
We started this deep dive in the face of the winter that hunted men, where the very air was an enemy. And we've seen how the struggle for survival boiled down to this fundamental conflict in material science. The quick, brittle speed of American iron versus the durable, patient wisdom of German clay.
And that synthesis, the heat battery, it provided the definitive technological victory against the tyranny of the axe. It allowed settlers to reduce their labor, clean their living spaces, and achieve a stable, enduring warmth that redefined their quality of life on the frontier.
What really resonates most is the philosophical shift. The recognition that instant gratification, while it's appealing, it often leads to continuous, exhausting labor. The slow, deliberate approach, the ability of masonry to store energy, offered true liberation. It traded immediate heat for long-term endurance.
Indeed. The difference between high conductivity and high specific heat capacity was the difference between continuous reactive labor and strategic proactive foresight. The settlers found that by respecting the slowness of the material, they gained back their time and their health.
So, as you reflect on the energy demands and the technological choices of your own life, consider this final provocative thought on the value of slow technology. The solutions to your most persistent challenges, whether you're building wealth or fostering relationships or heating your home, often require rejecting the instant-on solution and embracing the patience of the heat battery. Sometimes, the truly revolutionary act is simply giving things time to soak, knowing that endurance is the ultimate form of efficiency.